Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I am here today with Chana Brody. Chana Brody is a child of survivors and an immigrant. She shares with her audience her unique perspective on what it is like to be aware from an early age that her parents went through something quite horrific and the long-term effect that experience had on her life. In 2018, Chana visited her country of birth, the Czech Republic, and is eager to share what she has learned in Terezín, as well as to share how previously closed or neglected synagogues are being restored and given a new purpose. So I am thrilled to welcome you here today, Chana. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you so much for the Holocaust Center. Every time I give one of these talks, I think about what my parents would think that we are doing this. The people who are listening, the interest that there is, I think they would find it so gratifying. After all, it gives validity to what they have gone through. It gives a voice to what they have gone through, and it makes them, in one way, live on. I'm never ceased to amaze that I've been giving these talks for about 20 years. And they're constantly evolving because as I age, my perspective changes. I go back to my home country. I've been now back a couple times. So, of course, that changes my perspective as well. The loss of my parents changes my perspective. And the addition of grandchildren, that is another layer that then changes what I will talk about. And it is interesting because with all of these changes, I see that the Holocaust and the experience that my parents had, and then as a result, the next generations have had, is still there. It is not something that has died when my parents died. It is both a good thing and a bad thing. And I deal with it by speaking to groups, by speaking to adults, by speaking to students, and sharing my experience with them. I am now going to talk about my first awareness that my parents and our lives were a little bit different than that of my peers. I grew up in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, in a magnificent little town south of the German border, so in northern Czechoslovakia, that was home to the textile industry magnates in the winter. It was basically a ski town. And from the very time I recall having a memory, I always felt different. That difference came from not necessarily being Jewish, although I was aware early on that my religion was different. I was not crossing myself when my friends did. But I knew it on a different level because all my friends had grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins living within walking distance of their homes. And they would always tell me where they were going. And I didn't have that. If I wanted to see my relatives, which were my aunts and uncles and my first cousins, I had to travel either to Hungary, to Budapest, where my mother had a sister, brother-in-law, and I had a first cousin, a male, or we had to travel to the Ukraine, which is the very western part of Russia, where my father and mother each had a sister and their families, and there were 3 cousins there. What also made those trips more difficult, other than being on a train for a number of hours, and I did suffer from motion sickness, so that was never something I looked forward to, was that they all spoke different languages. So every summer, whether we traveled, we took turns, whether we traveled to Budapest or the Ukraine, Uzhgorod, I had to learn how to speak, again, Hungarian or Russian. Russian was not as much of a problem because starting in 2nd grade, Russian was our required language. My cousins studied English, but we, under communism, had to study Russian. And my Hungarian cousin spoke nothing else other than Hungarian, so I would learn Hungarian. He would, of course, be very helpful in teaching me, especially the swear words, which made our parents really upset, but we had a good time together. But so already I had a very different experience. Our furniture also looked very different in our apartment. All of our friends had IKEA type of furniture, you know, the very modern apartment-like furniture. We had very heavy, beautiful Biedermeier furniture. I learned later on in life that the apartment we shared with an older lady, she had her own section of the apartment, and it was a huge pre-World War II apartment. It was a villa that actually belonged to the Batya family, B-A-T-A. If you look them up today, it is a very large shoe factory consortium in Toronto. So the company is still there, and the villa belonged to the mistress of the Batya magnate. And we lived there sharing it with her. She knew that the communists would confiscate her 7 rooms that she had furnished from the hotel from where she was evicted, because her husband was German and she was Jewish post-World War II. He ran back to Germany after liberation, and she had to leave the hotel because now the hotel belonged to communists. So we had this furniture at our disposal, and it was magnificent, but I didn't know it at the time. And my childhood, other than that, was kind of idyllic. I was an only child, had my parents' full attention. We loved hiking, we loved gardening, and just had a normal childhood. Except when my mother started sharing with me pretty early on her experiences as a young child. We all want to know our parents' story at one time or another. We did not have a TV at the time, and if we did, it was just, once we did, it was just one channel TV. So when I would come home from school for lunches, my mother would entertain me with stories of her youth. And besides learning that she grew up in the town of Berehova with 9 siblings, the youngest of the 9 siblings, and their parents died very early on. The father died, my grandfather died of pneumonia, and my grandmother died of a tooth infection. So they were orphaned quite early, but the siblings all took care of each other until they were deported. So the story always ended with this deportation, where my mother said they took the candlesticks and a few pieces of china, and this is a good time as any to show you the prayer book that survived. That is, the spine is not in great condition, but of course it is my most precious thing. It even has an address of McKeesport relatives that's very, very faint in here, that the family had in Pittsburgh, near Pittsburgh. And they hid them up in the attic, and they had to give away all their things, and they had to gather in a town square. And it always ended there. Her childhood memories, the great memories, ended there. And I would say, what happened to you? And she would tell me that, you know, they were taken to a labor camp and a concentration camp. She would skim over those details when I was really young. But she would tell me that after the war, she and my father met, and they had these dances, and it was extremely romantic, of a story that she wove to me. And they got engaged, and then they moved to Liberec, which is my hometown. And all the friends that they had, and she named the families who were my friends, I had children of these friends, they also met there. And so to me, it sounded like a fun camp where they had dances and parties, and little by little, they met up and paired up and became couples and got married. And then they all ended up in the hometown of Liberec. Apparently, there was a good job market. My parents were one of the first ones to arrive, and word traveled, and they all were there. So I call them aunts and uncles, but I knew that they were not my blood aunts and uncles. As I got a little bit older, the stories got a little bit darker. My mother started telling me that they were beaten, that when they arrived at the camp, they had to stand for hours at Appel, and it would be cold. She told me that her sister, the one closest to her, who was a very gifted poet, actually just published her very first book. had a big mouth and mouthed off to the capo. Capo were the guards. And the capo sometimes were Jewish and sometimes they were Polish. And she threatened to take all the sisters and make sure that they died. They begged, they said they would work, they would take care of each other. My mother was only 14 when they were deported. That's an important fact because when I talk to students at schools, they, a lot of times they are 13, 14 years old. And I make sure that I mention that fact because then they can put themselves in that space. They can imagine what it would be like to be torn apart from their parents, to witness the horrific things that are going on around you, to ask why are those chimneys burning and be told by those who have inmates who've been there longer that that's your relatives burning in there. My mother always said that when they arrived at the camp, she thought they were at a camp, an asylum for men, because they looked, they were wearing striped uniforms and their heads were shaved. And it wasn't until she herself had her head shaved and was in those uniforms that she realized that she was in the women's section of Auschwitz. They were very fortunate in that one day during Appel, they were asked to volunteer for job duty. And she and her sisters raised their hand. Linda Hurwitz, who I've known for many years, who was also part of the Holocaust Center, used to call those choiceless choices. You made these choices, you thought, well, how much worse can my life be? But many times it actually would be even worse, which is hard to imagine. But my mother and her sisters were extremely fortunate. They were able to, they were taken on by truck to a farm, hired out, of course, slave labor to the farmer who was raising crops for the German army. And they could even steal a potato or a vegetable once in a while to supplement the very meager food that they got. And so they started eating better than they did at the camps. And they were locked up every night at the barn. So the biggest fear became that there would be a fire and they would be locked in the barn. But they didn't have to face the chimney every day, and they didn't have to face the dogs. And they were there for about 9 months till liberation. When liberation came, it was March, it was wintertime. They were taken by truck, of course, back to the camp and then told to march from there. The march was brutal. Her sisters, the 5 of them that were together the entire time, the one sister contracted typhoid and died right there on the side of the road. My mother said that she saw her fall. She knew she was dead. She couldn't go on, and yet they couldn't help her. And she said she didn't even cry. There was nothing left. She said that very early on it became apparent that if you wanted to survive, you had to turn all your emotions off because it was just too difficult to take and to bear. So they kept on marching in the cold. And when finally they were liberated, woke up in the morning by the side of the road and the Germans were gone. And the Russians liberated them. That was my mother's fortune. The Russians saved my mother's life because the toes on her one foot froze and they had to amputate. They were going to take the rest of the foot if that wasn't sufficient for gangrene. And she begged the doctors not to do that, to give her a chance, give her body a chance to heal, because she was only 17 years old. So, she was close to 15 perhaps by the time this was going on. By the time she was in the hospital recovering from all of this, she just had her 17th birthday. So between the months at camp and the months at the farm, that is where she grew up. And many times American mother-in-law would be discussing the dances that they had during World War II and how they had these JCC and Y dances. And I would always reflect and think about where my mother was during those times. And the only thing that separated them was geography. They were both Jewish, but one was lucky enough to be born in the United States, and one was unlucky enough to be born in World War II, torn Europe. My mother, after the war, had to leave the hospital where she was recuperating, the sanatorium my mother and my father met, because she recovered sufficiently and there was no longer a reason to keep her there. Her tuberculosis recovered, her toes recovered, and she had nowhere to go. My father was not quite yet ready to get engaged. This is my family story. My father was actually engaged to another young lady, and she followed her sister to Israel with the idea that when my father would be recovered sufficiently, he would follow her. Of course, communism closed all borders. There was no longer any possibility of immigration. So my dad had yet another loss and had to decide if he was ready to form another relationship. Thankfully, he was. He came to get my mother in Prague and asked for her hand. Lauren mentioned that in 2018, we went to visit my girlfriend. So this is a good spot. Again, we go on many tangents to tell you that story. My mother befriended a non-Jewish girl who was also recovering from tuberculosis after the war. And when she found out that my mother had no place to go, she said, "That's okay, you'll come live with us in Prague." And this was days before phones. People didn't have phones in their homes necessarily. They might have gone to a neighbor's or to a store if they needed to make a phone call. So she just brought my mother to Prague. The parents opened the door, glad to see their daughter back from the hospital from recovery. And she said, "Here's Anne. She has nowhere to go. Can she live with us?" And they said, "If there's room for 5, there's room for 6. They had 3 children and the parents living in a 2-room apartment that the communists, again, made them live in. I never cease to tell that story without tears in my eyes because they saved my mother. They gave her a place to go. And I always think, what did she know of the world? I mean, she was 14 to 15 years old when they were deported. She was 17 years old when she got out of the sanatorium. She didn't know anything about the world. She was a child that was always taken care of by her siblings, and now she was all alone. So Jaromila really saved my mother again. Jaromila's daughter, Dana, is my very closest friend. She is my sister at heart. And she's the one that we visited when we went to Prague twice previously. The last time, she said, "Let's go take a walk." She lives in Ževnice, which is where her grandparents lived, which is where my mother went to live after she left Prague, waiting for my dad to come get her. And Dana said, "Do you recognize this gate?" And I didn't. I was a child when I left Czechoslovakia at the age of 11. And it was indeed her grandparents' house. So it was extremely emotional because not only did my mother and my father get engaged there, but I spent some wonderful, wonderful times with Dana's grandparents there as well, who of course became my surrogate grandparents. So now I have that story. When I talk to students, sometimes there's no time for this story, but I thought it's a sweet story and a good ending. My mother told her story with a lot of detail. If this is an adult audience, I will share that she shared with me the Mengele experiments, what she knew of them, that the beautiful girls were made to build bricks houses, and then they would be later on taken for other nefarious reasons. My cousin shared with me, which my mother did not, but this is a postscript that I learned after the war, that a Nazi gave my aunt and this is my mother's sister-in-law, a coat. And my first cousin surmised from that perhaps they had some kind of a relationship, and she was an extremely emotionally shut off woman after this. So all these little threads that go through my life, all this little knowledge that I learned even as an adult. My father's story was a little bit more harsh and brutal than my mother's, because she was at least able to be on the farm. And although she suffered physical trauma, she had the love of her sisters around her supporting her, which made a big difference. My father lived in a tiny, tiny village of Shandarev in Ukraine. Till 1969, it was so small. We hear of these little shtetls, like in Fiddler on the Roof, which is where they came from. The road was still not paved. And right before we immigrated and went to Ukraine for the last time to visit, to say goodbye to his sister, we were supposed to see his hometown. All my American friends, even if their parents didn't grow up in Pittsburgh, eventually would go visit the town where the grandparents lived and see the house. So for me, I was really excited to see where my dad came from. but it rained hard the night before, and the road was impassable in 1969. So my dad lived his idyllic life. He said a third of the village was Jewish, and of the third of the Jews, he was related to half of them in one way or another. One day, my dad did a family tree, sort of. It was not formal, but he just counted the number of relatives. We're talking first circle, so aunts, uncles, first cousins, grandparents, so forth. 92 members of his family were murdered. And I always choose the word murdered instead of lost or died. They didn't die, they were murdered. So I always think of the great family that we would have had it not happened for World War II. They were sheep farmers. They didn't take care of the sheep themselves. They had shepherds taking care of the sheep up in the mountains. And my father would go into the mountains every so often and check on the shepherds, had great stories, got surrounded by wolves one time. So I thought, wow, that's so cool. And he had this also idyllic childhood, surrounded during holidays, during Jewish holidays, by tons and tons of family. He woke up every morning from the age he was in second grade and would go to Cheder, which is Jewish Hebrew school, where he spoke Yiddish as he did at home, and then would pray and learn in Hebrew. Then he would go to Czech schools, because at that time Ukraine belonged to Czechoslovakia. It was part of the Czechoslovakian Empire, as was my mother's place. So actually, my parents' birth certificates both say Czechoslovakia, but they spoke different languages because there were appropriated lands. And then he would study Czech all day in school. Then he would come home after school and play soccer with the Russian kids, speaking Russian with them. And then again, Yiddish at home. So for him, he flowed in and out of these languages very easily from a very early age. In ninth grade, he had to stop studying and could no longer go to school. And he tells me that he decided when he was 15 to join the partisans. The partisans, because they lived up in the mountains, were very active. These were not necessarily Jewish partisans, but they were partisans, and already they were starting to cause trouble for the Germans. He was very proud of going up there and left his family. The problem was that he was the eldest of 4 children, my grandfather having died of natural causes, and grandmother counting and thinking of my dad as the head of the household. When their order for deportation came through, he decided to come visit them, because he would always come down from the mountains every Friday and spend Friday night with them and then go back up again on Sunday. And his mother said, you need to come with us, because whatever happens with us, you need to be there. He thought long and hard about it. He really enjoyed being with the partisans. And he had to make a choice one more time, when he had to make a choiceless choice. Would he live when he went with them? Would he have a better chance of surviving if he didn't? Life with partisans was extremely dangerous. Jews were always hunted for money. The farmer could always turn in the partisans, especially the Jewish partisans, for extra cash. So the farmer who might give them milk one day could turn them in the next day for offer of money or for being threatened themselves. So it was an extremely dangerous, precarious lifestyle he chose. And he survived the camps. Would he have survived? We don't know. Again, you always take a road in the path, and you don't know if it's the right one or not. His mother begged him to stay with them as the head of the household, and he did. They were made to walk 12 and a half kilometers to the nearest town, where they took a few apartment buildings, moved the people from the apartment buildings to the homes of the Jews that were vacated, and then moved all the Jews into these 2 apartment buildings. Every family got 1 room. My father felt very fortunate that there were only 5 of them, and that they were not crowded in. Many families had 8 or 9 children plus grandparents, so you can imagine how difficult the situation was there. At one point, my father was even permitted to go back home to get additional supplies, get flour and so forth. When he went home, their home was stripped bare. There was nothing there, and their prize cow was living next door The neighbors, of course, said, well, the cow needed attention, which it did. But my father was so upset, he took the cow out into the pasture, slapped it on its rump, and sent it packing because he was so upset that there was nothing left of their childhood. Even though we had candlesticks from my mother and the prayer book, which were found in the attic post-war, there's absolutely nothing surviving of my dad's childhood. I said that my narrative evolves. As I grow a little bit older, I'm starting to go through my records, through my things, starting to decide what my children would like, what my grandchildren would like. And I never had any of that. They didn't have the opportunity to discard anything that was not deemed important. It was just gone. After living in that apartment building for 6 months, they were told to, again, gather their belongings and that they were going to be relocated. Now, he said that the worst thing about living in that apartment building in the town was that they had absolutely no information. They didn't know if they would be moved, when they would be moved, where they would go. Until then, Jews were sent already. The men in town from Chana were already working labor camps in Hungary. The labor camps were bad, but they were just that. They weren't killed there. They just, as long as they worked, they were okay. They were allowed to get parcels and mail from home. So it was an existence that, while not idyllic, was not life-threatening necessarily. And they could even come home sometimes for a visit for a weekend and then go back to the labor camp. So they were hoping that they were just going to be sent to a labor camp and that the children and the women would just stay wherever while the men worked. As they started marching toward the train, that was another 2.5 kilometer walk, they were all talking about where they were going. Now, we use these terms when they were marched, 12.5 kilometers. I know how hard that is to walk. Imagine having to walk the elderly, babies, young children with your packages. How horrible even just that march must have been. They were put on trains. My mother was put on a train too. My mother's train experience was that the cattle cars, which were exactly that, for those of you who don't know, who have not been to the Holocaust Center in Washington, D.C., it is out of all the exhibits, the cattle car that they have there touched and tore me up the most, because you realize how dark it is, how crowded it must have been with 50 or 60 people in it, how terrifying and cold it must have been if you were transported in the winter, and how incredibly hot if you were transported in the summer. One window with bars, no other light. Enough people crowded in where there was no room to sit. You basically had to stand. A bucket for water and a bucket for elimination. These were modest people. These are people who nobody ever saw doing anything that wasn't proper, modestly dressed. The horror that they must have experienced. My mother actually tells of a girlfriend that she had who she used to always be very jealous of because she had better toys and dolls than my mother had. That girl went mad, crazy, by the time they opened the door in Auschwitz. She couldn't handle it. It's good to remark here that who had the best chance of surviving Auschwitz besides luck? People who were already deprived, people who didn't have too much food, people who were used to maybe going to bed a little more hungry, who didn't have all the cushions, and the more cozy you were in life, the more difficult the adjustment was to the camp life. So my father had the very same experience of emerging. He said the doors were swung open in Auschwitz, bright lights, they must have arrived at night, shone in their faces. Achtung, Achtung, mach, mach, walk, get out, get out. Dogs were barking, butts of guns were hitting everybody who wasn't moving quickly enough. And as soon as he got off, he was separated from everybody. His siblings were all younger than he. His mother had her son and daughter and with her, and she also was carrying her niece in her arms because her niece also had an infant, so she was carrying another little niece. They were all separated immediately and sent off to the gas chambers. My father's other sister, the one that was closest to him in age, did survive, but he didn't know that she survived until 1951. She went back to the Ukraine And eventually, when they were allowed to communicate between communist countries, he was able to get information that she survived. But he was with no one, as he was throughout most of his camp experience. So here he was also, if my mother was 15, then he would have been 17, 18 years old, a youngster, again, with nobody around him, torn from that very comfortable, surrounded by family life that he was used to since he grew up. Because he was young and strappy, he was taken to the quarry mines to work. The quarry mines were mines where they were opening up huge tunnels that will be wide enough eventually for 2 jeeps to pass, to store the loot, to act as bunkers in case they needed them. So they were deep in the ground, and there weren't, they handed these rocks pretty much by pushing them and carrying them out by hand. This is extremely difficult, hard physical labor. And they labored on this from sunrise to sunset. My father went through 4 different camps, and he said that in most of them he never saw daylight. He didn't know what they looked like. They would be marched out before sunrise and marched back in at sunset. So during the summer, very long days. On the very first day, a young boy was given a whip and told to whip anybody who didn't work hard. The boy cried, said he would never do that, and they shot him immediately. Then they offered the whip to the next person and asked them if they'd be willing to whip anybody who didn't work hard. It's not hard to imagine that the person acquiesced and said, I will, even if they didn't do it hard. They didn't want to die. Also, when they came out of the quarry that first day, it was hot, and they all rushed the water bucket. The SS said, nobody drinks water till I say yes, and he kicked it with his boot, and nobody drank water until the very night. After such hard labor, they were given about 500 calories a day. That was the standard offering of food that they figured out everybody had. No matter what camp you were in, that was pretty much the standard. Bread, a piece of bread in the morning with a coffee, the coffee being some brown water that posed as coffee. Nothing at lunch. And when you finally marched back into camp, a soup made with the leftovers from the Nazis, soup, vegetables, maybe once in a while a piece of meat if you were lucky. Whatever was ladled out to you. It could have just been the broth. It could have been some vegetables. It could have even been a piece of meat. And you had to hold on to your bowl carefully, because if you didn't have a bowl, you couldn't eat. And a piece of bread. And that was it. So under 500 calories a day, performing hard labor. It wasn't very long before my father's bulky weight was, of course, diminished, and until he became skinny, scrawny, sick. When he didn't work hard, he was beaten. And he was very close to death, he felt. He felt that he could no longer survive. That's when he was transported to Dora. And in talking to people that he was transported with, somebody said, wait, there is somebody named Rosenberg from your village. Well, that Rosenberg happened to be his uncle, Rosenberg. And he was in favor with the Nazis because he was a very gifted portrait artist. And he painted portraits for the Nazis. And he was able to intervene on my dad's behalf to say, this man is my nephew, he is dying. Could you please put him into the factory where they make brooms instead of in that hard labor, quarry labor, where he is soon going to die. And they listened to him, and they let my dad join the force of the broom factory. And he said he felt like he died and went to heaven, because even though he was inside a non-heated building, he was no longer carrying rocks, and he felt for the first time since he was deported that he had a chance of survival. This is where I always pause to tell the students that after the war, most people denied ever having known about concentration camps. The thought was that these were some faraway, hidden, dark, deep in the woods places where the general public had no idea what was going on. Generally, this was not true. When I went to Theresen, I saw the barracks where the Nazi families were housed. Very lovely. When I saw other camps, Auschwitz used to be a town. And then again, outside of Auschwitz, there were people living there. People knew what was happening. They just turned the other way. One day, my father was actually asked to take a portrait that my uncle painted back to the Nazis' family. I always think, well, why didn't my dad run? Well, if he would have run, his uncle would have been shot. So that was a good impetus not to run. My father entered the home of the Nazis' family, delivering the portrait. And the woman said, wait, I have something for you. And she went into the kitchen to give him a piece of bread and an apple. While he was waiting, he looked around, and there was a mirror on the side. And he looked in the mirror, and he literally had to touch the mirror physically, because it was an old man looking back at him. This is still at this time, teenage boy who looked like an old man. He got this again during liberation. The Americans who liberated him said, how did all these old men survive? And he said, none of us are old. We're all young, but they looked like they were old. Just like for my mother, liberation couldn't come soon enough. And my dad was put on a death march. He said he just marched knowing that if you stopped to tie your shoelaces, if you did anything at all, you would be shot. He was wearing shoes stuffed with newspaper. These shoes did not belong to him originally. They were found, somebody next to him died, and he was able to get shoes because until then he only had clogs, which were no protection at all from the snow. But now he had a pair of shoes that were stuffed with newspapers for additional insulation. He also somehow lost his uniform, his striped uniform, and he had this very big kind of a coat over him that he found rope and was able to tie it around him and stuff that full of newspapers. So you have this extreme of cold and very little protective clothing. If you ever look at the uniforms that are hanging in different museums, they're cotton, and this is all they had to protect them from the cold. He marched on knowing that he had to, and at night they were ushered into a farm and into a barn and locked in there. And he buried himself in the hay, and he said he was not going to leave the next morning when they were dragged out again. He said he would rather die there with a gunshot than to die on the side of the road like a dog. And when they were indeed yelling for them to get out, he hid himself and he did not leave. The Nazis at that point were in a great hurry to get out. They were not counting as they did back in the camps, and they left without him. He fell back into an exhaustive sleep, and he wakes up with a fellow inmate who happens to be a Russian, holding a piece of bread, offering it to him. And my dad always said, I was so confused. The day before, there was no bread. And if there was bread, it certainly would not be shared. Well, the inmate recounted to him that they were liberated as they were walking, as they were being marched. The bombs fell closer and closer, and the American army was moving closer, and the Nazis fled, just leaving them by the side of the road. They were liberated. And now what do you do? So the Americans liberated my dad. They offered a lot of people chocolates and peanut butter and all kinds of heavy food that actually killed them. They could not, their stomachs had to be slowly readjusted to food. And my dad remembers a man saying, the same man who said, how come you're all old here? Starting to cry, and he started speaking Yiddish to him. He was a Jewish, American Jewish serviceman who liberated them and started setting up communication between the liberated inmates and the Red Cross. The Red Cross, of course, was starting to set up lists of those who survived and those who were looking. They each got a train pass so they could go back to where they could go to. My father was deemed not healthy enough to travel anywhere, and he was taken by the U.S. Army to a hospital. He also had tuberculosis to slowly recover. And once he was recovered enough, then he was sent to the Tatra Mountains for further recovery in the mountain air. My girlfriend Dana's mother, who is still very much alive, Yaramila, who took my mother in, I should say, recounts that they had to eat full meals, and until their plates were clean, they weren't allowed to leave. They had forced rest time, where 2 hours they were not allowed to read or anything. They just had to lay in bed in chairs after lunch so that their bodies could absorb all the calories they were given. They were taken outside in the fresh air to recover. And this is where the more unhealthy survivors were taken for full recovery. And all these people that my mother and my father met and how they met share the same experience in that a lot of their siblings immigrated. My mother's brother and sister during this time applied for asylum in Italy and crossed over through Germany into Italy illegally. And my aunt was actually carrying a child, and she lost that child because of the strenuous mountain walking they had to do. And so they came to America. My mother's other two sisters, one went to Hungary, one went to Ukraine. My father's sister went to Ukraine. So by the time my parents recovered sufficiently, they were not able to join any of their family. The little family that was left, they were not able to join or even have communication with. So they all went to Liberec and formed a family. I don't know. I never asked if they spoke about the Holocaust or not. They probably didn't have to. Just having that shared common experience gave them so much in common and made their bond so strong. In 1964, you were allowed to immigrate for religious purposes, but only to Israel. My mother's sister, my parents didn't have anybody other than first cousins living in Israel. Uncle Rosenberg was in Israel. But my father and my mother did not want to leave their sisters in the communist bloc, and they chose to stay behind. But my dad did pack up 3/4 of the Jewish population of Liberec, and they immigrated to Israel. And I communicate with a lot of those children who now through Facebook were kind of rediscovering each other, because I was only 6 years old. So I don't recall that immigration, but they remember me because they were slightly older than I was. My father, after the war, lied about his education. If had they known what he went through, they would have known. But he said he finished high school. He got a college degree. He got a master's degree, and he supervised over 100 people that in a factory, in a corporation, agricultural corporation. And his job was to set the prices for wheat, barley, and corn according to the markets. So we went to farms all the time. I would accompany him to farms. He would see the production. He would do all the work. And it was a very important job. My mother did not work at all because she got compensation from Germany and from the Czech government for her disability because of her foot and her tuberculosis. So she stayed home with me. And it was interesting because in Czechoslovakia, everybody had to work. So all the kids went to daycare from the time they were born, pretty much. They had like 3 weeks at home, and then they went to daycare. Well, my mother was home, so I would actually ask her to give me a key around my neck so that I could be a latchkey kid, just like all my friends whose parents were actually not home, even though she was home, so I would fit in a little bit better. And in 1968, communism was having its downfall in Czechoslovakia. We had a lot of freedom of speech, a lot of marches for freedom. What's going on today, this is actually taped for posterity. This is taped in June of 2020. We're going through the COVID. We're going through Black Lives Matter marches. And they remind me of the freedom, of the marching, of change that needs to be coming, of when I was going through that in 1968. We were in Hungary at the time. It was very difficult for us to come back to Czechoslovakia. We'd wait 4 days to come back. And when we finally did, my father said, "That's it, I'm leaving." A third of the higher educated Czechs left at that time, Czechoslovakia. They would go to Yugoslavia for a summer vacation, quote unquote, or they would ski into Austria. My girlfriend actually showed me the restaurant where they would all gather and put on their backpacks and then go skiing and then ski right into Austria. So my parents had a choice to make. Do they wish to join their American brother and sister? My mother's at least in America, tried to immigrate. And my father said, "No, we're not leaving illegally ever again. I lost everything that I've worked for once. My parents did, he said, and I worked very hard in my life for everything I have, and I'm not leaving it all behind again." They applied for a visa, and much to my unhappiness, they got a visa and became legal immigrants October 9th of 1969. Came straight to Pittsburgh, where my aunt lived at the time. My aunt was the oldest one of the 9 children. She took care of my mother from the time my mother was 11 years old. And the idea was that my mother, being the youngest, would take care of her in her old age. Ironically, Aunt Irene outlived each and every single one of the siblings. And my mother died very young at the age of 62. I sort of come full circle here because I am now 62. My grandchildren are 6 and 3, as my children were when my mother died. And I said, none of us really had modeling of what happens after the age of 6 and 3, how grandparents act, because my mother had no parents around when she was raising me. I didn't have her around after the age of 6 and 3 of my children. And so I'm each year here henceforth will be interesting because the grandchildren will hopefully, God willing, have a grandmother into old age. My life is very different now. I always, you never stop thinking about your parents, and I'm a golfer now, and I think what will my parents think of that? But I still look at the world through a different lens. I look at the marches now for freedom, and I know that what my parents went through was horrific, and what everyone's going through is horrific, and it's everybody's story. But I appreciate the fact that my parents never once said to me when I was going through anything difficult that was nothing important ever, that, look what we went through, no matter what's happening in the world, whether it's marches for freedom or whether it's COVID, nothing ever tops the horrific experience my parents went through. And that's quite something, because that in history has to stand as one of the cruelest, most inhumane acts of man to man. And that's why I tell my parents' story. I always tell students, why am I here? I'm not here so that you can feel bad for me. I'm not here because my parents' story is not your story. But it is such a horrific chapter in humanity of what one person can do to another, that it needs to be applied and remembered and made sure that it never happens again. And it is my responsibility, as that of those who hear my story, to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, to seek out justice, to be an upstander instead of a bystander, because a bystander is nothing more than a collaborator. And so that's the message I give, and that's how I try to honor my parents' story. So I thank you very much. I know that Lauren has some questions that I would love to answer. My talks are never the same. They're always off the cuff. I remember to tell some things and not others, but I hope that this was informative and helpful. And again, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to share my story and my parents' story with you. Our parents' names were Anne and William Jakubovic, and my name is Chana Jakubovic Brody. Thank you so much.
Chana, your story is so incredible, and you tell it so beautifully. So beautifully.
Thank you.
And well, I have questions that I want to ask you, and now
and I didn't talk about Teresa at all, so if we can get back to that.
We could definitely talk about that. I now have 20 more questions because
Good.
You touch on so many things that are so important, and I'm grateful to you for drawing so many connections with what's happening right now in this very strange moment, but also a moment of opportunity, I think, for justice in this country after a very long time. And I'm so interested in your comparing it to Czechoslovakia in 1968. So I actually want to come back to communism, because this is something that definitely resonates with people my age, and maybe less so with students now unless they're watching The Americans. I'm intrigued that you were separated from your aunts, and that some of them were not that far away from you, but it was very hard to see them. I'm thinking of students now who are so used to being able to communicate all over the world if they want to through social media. Can you reflect a little bit for the students who are going to watch this, and even for the parents, about how difficult it was for you to communicate with the remaining family your parents had?
So not only, you think of the communist bloc as being a bloc, but when Stalin was in charge, he even did not allow free communication between the bloc till 1952, I believe. And again, these records, can be verified. But once communication was allowed to be established, it was only by mail, right? There were phone calls were almost unable, they were not able to talk by phone. and they had to talk in code because there was censorship and these letters were read. So they had to actually establish, different kind of codes in case the letters were read. If there was something in there that was not acceptable, the letter would just be thrown away. So if you wanted to make sure the letters went through, you had to make sure they were allowed. So that was very interesting. Then when travel was allowed in between the countries, what I did not mention in my talk is that we would go with like 5 suitcases because Czechoslovakia, Hungary at that time had the most material goods. We had quite a number of, our stores were pretty flush, and Russia was extremely empty. So we would be always bringing, we would get these lists of things that we had to bring along with us. So we traveled back much lighter than we traveled there, bringing all these things to the different relatives. Not all of them were well off. I had a very bucolic existence there because my father's sister lived out in the country, and she walked barefoot from like April until September. That's just what they all did. And I found, as a city girl, I found that so interesting. Life outhouses. I mean, the life there was such a throwback, even in early 60s, from what I experienced living in a city that was not Prague. So whereas Budapest was very advanced and they had amazing pastries, and I remember those. So those times that we spent there were really precious to my parents because they could actually say what they wanted to say. They could catch up with one another and be in each other's presence. But it must have been also so sad for them that they knew that time was measured. It was a week or 2 at a time. And then they would have to go back to their old country for the whole year and be separated. And again, only letters. And we all know how those go. By the time the letter arrives, it's old news. So for students and people today, it's so hard to imagine when, I connect, as I said, I connect with the Czech families. I connect with some of their children now on Facebook, and we're sending each other's pictures and we're communicating. And we all, I think, just not take it for granted, but it's just part of our lives. And to think that communication used to be so difficult and so precious, and then to have it censored on top of that is just so different.
So you mentioned when you were telling your story that when the visa came through for your family to come to the United States, how unhappy you were. What was it like for you? So you were 11 years old.
So I was 11, and I was hoping that we wouldn't get the visa because I was afraid of learning English. I knew you spoke a different language, and I didn't know much about America. One thing this is such a little nugget of something that's so interesting. So when I was young, playing Americans, we played cowboys and Indians, just like you did. But guess who the good guys were? Indians. Because the cowboys were Americans, capitalists and communists. Capitalists and Americans, right? So we all want to be, if you want to be the good guy, you were the Indian. You were the Native American. So I knew very little about America. We saw just a few movies, James Bond movies or whatnot. So it was intriguing, but I didn't want to leave my country. This is where I was born. This was my home. My parents did not quite feel the same way, and they were looking forward to, reuniting. My father was very worried of leaving because he had, as I mentioned, a very high position, and he was Jewish. And he thought, even though the Czechs didn't care that he was Jewish, he was worried that if Russians had undue influence again, that he would be removed from his position. So, and also he was ready for a little more religious freedom. So that was a reason. Religious freedom was also part of it. I was 11 and a half. The children who were growing up, who were Czech in my hometown, were marrying outside of their faith because there just weren't enough Czechs. And my father wanted me to be able to have a choice of who I married, whether it was Jewish or not. He wanted me to have that option. And that option would not have existed there. So even though I did have a groom there, they called us the bride and the groom, my father's best friend's son. And we were playmates, and we met up this time in 2018. We met up together. He did marry a Hana, so he did marry a girl with my name, but we always tease each other. So I said to my husband, this is my husband. This is my Czech husband. So, but again, that religious freedom as I was growing up started being more and more important to my parents, and they wanted to give me that opportunity.
So, as I believe you know, in September of 2019, I visited the Czech Republic for the first time.
Yes.
So I got to see a lot of these places that you talk about, Prague, and we also went to Terezín for a day. It really is striking. So I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about what remains there of the Jewish community, because that's something that you alluded to.
Yes.
And also, let's definitely talk about that ghetto concentration camp hybrid, which was also a town where people lived and still live. What a strange experience visiting there.
Right. So that's, you touched upon it exactly. People are actually moving back to Terezín. Terezín was a normal city. What it had that was very different is that it was a walled city. So it was very easy to contain and it actually acted. So my girlfriend, when she got us tickets, Donna said, do you want to go to the small or to the large containment area? And I said, I don't know. I mean, I didn't know. So that small containment area was used for prisoners in World War I. So it was already set up as such. So it was very easy to transform it during World War II. People are now moving back to Terezín into the apartments. I was looking for Hannah Brady. If you ever saw the movie about Hannah Brady, Hannah Suitcase,
right?
Then you know that she drew a picture looking out of her, where she was imprisoned, looking at a church and a park bench. So when we went to Terezín, that was my quest, was to find the exact view so I could see what she saw. And of course, to find her name among the dead children, which, I lost it there. But people were walking their dogs. I had to be careful not to walk in dog crap as I was walking through this park. Rent is cheap, and people are moving back in spite of the history. So that was a great shock. And compared to Auschwitz, which we didn't talk about my trip to Auschwitz with my parents, it was not very, it felt more like a museum than an actual horrific kind of a place. And of course, Auschwitz Terezín was as awful as it was set up as a town to be a decoy against, for the Red Cross. They gave children candy and food so they would act like, hey, look, there is theater going on, there is school going on. But of course, it was all just a theatrical front for the Red Cross. But that's what struck me the most, that people were living in there again.
We went on an organized tour, and as we approached, it was probably 10 in the morning. There was a bar with people drinking outside at outdoor tables, and our tour guide even said something like, well, who would live here? And I mean, but this is not, as you said while you were telling your parents' stories, it's how it was. People lived either right by where the concentration camp, or even where the death camp was. People lived there. So anytime someone says that, people didn't know what was going on, everybody knew, because it was happening right in front of them. Right in front of them. You mentioned, related to that, you mentioned your father's cow and that the neighbors had it. And you also mentioned bystanders and collaborators. So it seems a good time to reflect a little bit on the role of these people who maybe stood to benefit by not saying anything.
They did. I mean, there are many stories, especially in Poland, of Jews returning home to claim their homes, or just to even see what was left of them, and being murdered. I mean, that's a story that definitely happened over and over again. These people survived these Jews survived this horrific concentration camp experience, only to be murdered in their own hometowns, because the fear was they were going to take back what was stolen from them. So there was great poverty in these towns. These homes were abandoned. You can say that people were taking care of the properties. People didn't return. They appropriated them. Again, it depends all on what people were raised with. So as a second generation, which is my generation, once removed from the concentration camp experience, we studied what made a person be somebody who would just take care of the things for the Jews until they return, and kindly be so happy to return to them. Who would say, I didn't see a thing, and hide what they took, and who would actually be the murderer. And it came basically on how they were raised. You know, if people are raised with, you help somebody. If people, I always tell students, if somebody drops a book, practice just picking it up. Then just say, hey, you dropped the book. Smile at somebody, you know, so that if you're constantly practicing good acts or acts of kindness, then when you are confronted by something that doesn't seem right, you will rise to the occasion. But most people are turned the other way, or this isn't my problem, and those who are actual bullies or who feel that they are less than actually then perpetrate an act to act greater than they are. And that's what Hitler exploited. You know, that's what the Hitler Youth exploited. People who had very little, people who were not given financially, or who had very little education, or who were not given any respect in the society, were all of a sudden promoted, were all of a sudden encouraged to become the bullies, became somebody's in their view. And they're the ones who perpetrated the worst acts, because all of a sudden they were given some power. So we know the story. We know the story here. We know the story. I mean, it's just a human story, but it's the worst kind.
And it's important for students to hear that, because sometimes when we're learning about the Holocaust, we learn about Hitler, maybe we learn about the top-ranking Nazis, and we don't learn enough about what ordinary people did to make it possible. It doesn't happen without the neighbors. So
Exactly.
It's so important to take from this that message of personal responsibility.
Yes.
That,
and I always thought, Lauren, correct me, Romania is the one that did not give up any of its Jews, correct?
Bulgaria.
I always think, okay, so Bulgaria. So Bulgaria serves as a great example of somebody saying, we're not going to give up our Jews. Greece, until they came storming in, also said, we will pay a ransom for our Jews. So when people chose to say no, they could save the Jews. So the complicitness is there. The complicity was there, and it's difficult for the countries who perpetrated that to hear and to take that responsibility. And you know what we're going through today is taking the responsibility for righting the wrongs. Poland has stepped back right now, right? They're saying that, you know, they suffered greatly during the Holocaust, and it is no longer, and again, not taking that responsibility, diluting it, and changing the light of history, especially as we get further and further away from what, you know, in time, in the timeline. It's easier to do that.
Right. And I mean, this is one of the things that we aim to do at the center, is to be sure that the history remains and that we study it and we know it and we endeavor to understand it. We're always learning more about the Holocaust, even as we get further and further away from it in years.
Sure.
More information comes to light. And by you telling your parents' stories, you keep those stories alive for future generations. I'm really grateful to you for that. I think we should wind down. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you want to say?
Should we go into the Auschwitz story, when I visited Auschwitz?
I would love it if you did, especially so you visited with your parents.
I visited with my parents, and unbelievably, I was 6 years old. There's actually a picture that's dated in the back. So my husband absolutely does not believe that I have a memory of this, but I think that when something very traumatic happens to you, even at a young age, you remember it. I was supposed to have a babysitter. They decided to go visit Auschwitz with a friend who was escaping to West Germany, and he buried a ruby ring that belonged to his mother under a tree when they got off the train in Auschwitz and were made to wait before coming through the gates. And since he would not have the opportunity to come back into communist Czechoslovakia or Poland in this case, he wanted to see if that ring was still there. And my parents, in their great wisdom, decided to accompany him. I was supposed to be with a babysitter. The night before the babysitter canceled, they had this trip all planned. They had nobody. See, again, there wasn't a cousin, aunt, uncle to take me that instead. So they decided to take me with them. And the minute we got off the train in Poland, a woman asked my mother for my sandals. She said, please, I have a daughter the same age. I will pay you whatever you want, but we can't get shoes here. So my mother opened the suitcase and took my sandals off my feet and put on an older pair of shoes on my feet, which I was not happy about because I just got those sandals. But again, trauma, losing my brand new sandals the minute we got to Poland. So that's my very first Polish memory. And then we went to see Auschwitz, and somehow we entered through the exit. And I remember seeing those enormous glass walls filled with, you know, the suitcases and the prosthetics and the hair and the glasses. And it made an amazing impression on me. But the dolls, there was actually a room filled with toys. And that I asked my parents, what happened? Where were these children? Because you couldn't tear me away from my toys. I loved all my dolls and toys, and I would never leave them. So I knew that something terrible, I just knew it. I just knew that something terrible had to happen here, that these children were separated from their toys. And that made an impression on me. I still recall that. And we came out into the glorious sunlight, which wasn't common in Poland. And a soldier came running after my parents, screaming something at them in Polish. And my father replied in Polish. And the soldier saluted my dad and clicked his heels. And that really intrigued me. And as soon as he left, I said, Daddy, what happened? And he said, well, we somehow entered through the exit, and children under 13 are not allowed to view this exhibit. And I told him that nobody asked my siblings when they were brought to Auschwitz how old they were before they were burned and gassed. So that was that story. So there's a picture of me in front of the barracks with my parents, and that picture is dated, so I know I was 6 years old.
Did you ever go back after that?
Heck no. I would never, you know, I have a very bitter memory of Poland from that time, very dark, very gray, very dreary. And when my daughter went with CDS on the March of the Living and followed by Israel, I made sure I told her that she would absolutely positively hate Poland. And she called me from Poland, and she said, I absolutely hate positively Poland. It was dreary. I mean, I was like, that's what I need to hear. And then she said it was so amazing going to Israel from there. So she went. But no, absolutely not. But I think everybody should, because that is, the museum in Washington, D.C. does an amazing, amazing job. But seeing the barracks for yourself and feeling the soil there, and you can just feel what happened there. It goes through your bones. So I do advise it, but not for me.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I did not visit any of the sites until recently, and it is a different and very important experience, if possible. And when we can travel again, because now travel is very limited.
Yes.
I do recommend for people who are really interested in going to these places and being where it happened is a very different experience. Everything we do to remember it here is at a remove.
Right. And it gives, I think that the souls appreciate our visits, and they need that. They need us to walk that soil again to remember. They know that they're remembered, and I'm a big believer in that. There has to be great unrest there just from everything that happened there. So yes, you should visit, and I did.
That's a beautiful way to think about it, and very meaningful to me too. Thank you. So let me ask you one last question. Where do you draw your strength to tell this very difficult story of your family?
Oh, yeah, that's important. I want to go into that. So the first time my children heard me talk, I was speaking I think it was through you at CMU, and my husband and my daughter accompanied me. So of course afterwards I said, what would you change? What can I do better? And she said, wow, you spoke so matter-of-factly, like you didn't put enough emotion in it. And I can't. I mean, even, I tear up when I talk about my friend Chana and them taking my mother in. All I have to do is think about my grandmother and her 2 young children going down to the gas chamber and being gassed. I would lose it then. There are different triggers that could make it a very different speaking experience and perhaps more engaging to my audience, but then I won't be able to continue. And whenever I do that, I always think of hearing survivors speak. So I remember distinctly going with a survivor to Shenley High School, which is a very inner city high school, seeing a young Black man in the front row after the survivor spoke. Now, I grew up with parents who had accents. Aunts and uncles had accents. And I thought, oh my God, they're never going to listen to this woman. She's a heavy Hungarian accent. And the tear that streamed down this student's face when she was done speaking, I knew that I could never duplicate that. I'm like a copy, like a Xerox copy of the real thing. I can only do so much, but there was nothing like seeing the survivor and having the survivor in front of you speaking their experience. And I used to also wonder, how do they speak of it so matter-of-factly? They're recanting horrific stories, and yet they just do it matter-of-factly because they have to. And also because I learned later, this is a little bit of psychology there, they had no emotions attached to those times. They had to, as my mother, they had to shut off all their emotions. So when they say we were marched, they can't attach emotions to that because they shut off their emotions during that time. They can have them later on, but they weren't experiencing emotions when they were going all through it. So that's maybe why they can get through it. But I always admire that, and I know the strength it takes. But again, it's with a purpose, and you have to do what you have to do, and then you can cry later.
Well, I am so grateful to you, and you tell the story beautifully.
Thank you, Lauren.
I'm so moved by just the experiences of your parents. They were so young. They were young like the students who visit the Holocaust Center. And to have survived that and made lives under communism, raised you, brought you here, and now you have grandchildren. It's a beautiful story, Chana. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, Lauren. I much appreciate it.